I'll begin with naming my co-authors on this presentation. So most of the work that I'm going to present was done and conceived by the following wonderful people: Quinn Solvey, Selena Gutierrez, Sylvain Alem, Chao Wen, Vince Gallo, Joe Woodgate, Ollie Lukola, Tom Ings, and Samadhi Galpage. So why have I got presumptuous enough to talk about a mind in the case of a bee? So let me explain a little bit what we animal psychologists mean when we're talking about animal minds. So what we have in mind is, or some of the things that belong into a mind are mental representations of things and of space and of things in space. We ask for bees as well as for monkeys and corvid birds and so on, whether they have flexible access to autobiographical memories, whether they can, in a sense, travel back in time and retrieve these memories. Also, whether, as opposed to an animal, a mindless animal that's permanently stuck in the present and just responding to currently incoming stimuli, we want to ask if animals, in this case bees, can look into the future, if they have an appreciation of the outcomes of their own actions. And perhaps most controversially, at the end, I'll explore whether bees could be said to have emotional states or feelings in some basic sense, at least. So I think there is a general understanding, I'm preaching to the converted, I guess, in saying that social insects can do amazing things. So here's an example, not from the world of bees, but from the world of termites. And you can see that the exterior structure, not in size, but in shape, is remotely similar from the La Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona. And the thinking is that, or the common thinking anyway, that these superficially similar structure come about by entirely different processes in the social insects on the one hand, and in humans on the other hand. The thinking in humans is that there is a mastermind, an architect who conceives the whole thing from the start and has the whole image of the final construction in their heads, and then passes down the instructions to builders who then put the preconceived plan into reality. And conversely, so people often think that in social insects, there is no such thing, that there's no planning, no overall appreciation of what the desirable outcome should be, but simply a building activity that's governed by simple rules where each individual from birth, by innate knowledge, knows exactly what to do. And then lots of individuals interact. And as a result of all these simple rules, complexity emerges, but without any kind of forward planning or a kind of master plan. And this is one of the stereotypes, that there is this dichotomy that I want to deconstruct a little bit tonight. So the controversy, I guess, is not necessarily new. People have thought about it for centuries, specifically with regard to the miracle that is the honeybee comb, which of course is unique all over the animal kingdom in terms of its regularity, its symmetry, its functionality. It's also mathematically optimal or close to optimal in terms of storage space maximized while minimizing material that's invested, and the stability is unique and so on. And people have thought for a long time how these things come about. And here's one suggestion by Charles Bonnet, a Swiss naturalist, who suggested the following: place together in the same room 10,000 automatons animated with a living force and all induced through the perfect resemblance of their outer and inner being. if we admit the least degree of feeling in these automatons, even only such as is necessary for them to be conscious of their own existence, seek their own conservation, avoid noxious things, prepare useful things, etc., their work will not only be regular, well-proportioned, similar, equal, but also will have symmetry, strength, convenience to the highest point of perfection. So here's an advocate, in a sense, of self-organization. He says it happens sort of by itself, but he assumes to be that there is a kind of, even though he calls bees automatons, he also assumes that there is some sort of consciousness in them, that that they seek their own conservation and so on, and that they have feelings, and that as a result of these conscious automatons with feelings, somehow by self-organization, this structure will just pop out. Now, it's not quite so simple. Not everything in the animal kingdom is as wonderful as the bees that we're all fascinated with. If you stick any random animal into a common space, even in large numbers, then something like honeycomb does not magically just pop out as a result of lots of individuals stuck together in a common environment. And humanity has made lots of relatively crude and cruel experiments, so to speak, with crowded animal conditions, but they don't just build honeycomb or any architecture for that matter just by themselves. So there has to be a little bit more than that. And another Swiss naturalist, François Huber, was the first to be interested in the inner workings of a bee colony. He wanted to know, how does this structure grow and how does it come about? And so what normally happens, as you all know, is that bees start at the top with their constructions and then gradually work their way down while they're building honeycomb along the direction of gravity. And Huber was interested in seeing what actually happens inside the colony in terms of the comb construction, and so experimented with glass screens at the tops and at the sides and so on, so that you could observe what actually went on inside. And the first thing that Huber and his team noticed was that the bees, if they had a choice, didn't like very much to attach their growing construction to glass, because it's a slippery surface. It's not optimal compared to a wooden surface. And so Huber and team observed, these are some impressions by Vince Gallo, who recently completed his PhD in my lab, replicating in images what Huber describes in words. So they observed that if they had a glass ceiling, the bees instead built the comb construction from the bottom and worked their way upwards rather than the normal top-down processes. So you might say, well, that still looks like a robotic process. It's still a repetitive routine of constructing same shapes over and over. But if you had built a robot replicating the natural process, if you programmed your robot to start at the top, use gravity as a reference, and work your way gradually down, that robot would already be lost with this task when you can't attach the construction to the ceiling. So there's already a degree of flexibility there that was perhaps surprising and departed what you would normally observe in nature. All right, said Huber and team. Now, what if instead of the bees being able to start from the bottom, we also put a glass sheet at the bottom? So now the challenge is even more complicated. The bees have a glass ceiling and a glass bottom. And what they did then, and you have to imagine these are all 200-year-old observations and quite remarkable experiments to explore the bees' flexibility in dealing with very unusual challenges. The bees in that case started on one of the side walls and then gradually worked their way with a lateral construction through the cavity until they reached the opposite wall. So again, there's a new degree of freedom here and a kind of challenge that bees in their evolutionary history had never encountered before. But the absolute masterpiece of the bees, and also in terms of experiments, as far as I'm concerned, by Huber, was this experiment. So after the bees had started their lateral construction through the cavity of the hive box, Hubert and team then inserted a glass sheet into the path of the growing comb construction. And as you all know, normally that's a two-dimensional sheet that just connects, it's just continued in a kind of 2D manner normally. So now there's a glass ceiling, a glass bottom, and during the construction, there was also a glass obstacle in the projection of the path of the construction. And what the bees did then, remarkably, was not continue their construction until they'd reached the slippery surface. But days before reaching that target wall, that slippery target wall, the bees turned around the whole construction 90 degrees and attached it to the nearest wood wall. And to me, the astonishing thing there is that this corrective action was not taken after encountering the glass obstacle, after building all the way there and then realizing, oh, this is no good, let's fix it somehow, but days before they got to that target. So they took corrective action to amend a future suboptimal outcome. And Hubert said the following upon observing this, that he acknowledged that he could not suppress a sentiment of admiration for an action in which the brightest foresight was displayed. Now, these experiments await replication. I'm still trying to encourage Vince to redo some of these tests. We need more modern sample sizes for them, but Hubert and his team say that they did this multiple times and always with the same result. But if it's verified with modern observations, then I think it is a remarkable experimental setup 200 years back, pushing bees to their limits in terms of what kind of challenges they can flexibly cope with, and asking questions about whether there's some sort of foresight or a planning ability in the comb. It might not necessarily turn out to be true, but it's an interesting perspective. Now, the way we nowadays study bees' intelligence is typically outside the hive. One reason being that it's simpler. We can observe the bees in their behavior under controlled conditions in a way that is not as easy inside the hive. But before I dive into this world of our experiments, just a brief reminder of how difficult it is to be a bee. So the first thing that you have to do, that you have to be good at, is spatial memory. So bees, as opposed to many other insects, in fact, many other animals, of course, have a home, and that's not just our familiar honeybee, but also bumblebees and the thousands of solitary bee species that are also out there. They all have to be really good at remembering the precise coordinates of their home. And this is not a trivial task if you have the size of a pinhead, the brain the size of a pinhead, and if you navigate over many miles regularly, especially as we'll see in a moment, in natural environments which are often not easy to remember. The challenge, I'll take a little detour here to solitary bees, in a sense is even more significant for these single mothers that are solitary bees, because if a honeybee colony loses a worker, then that's one of tens of thousands of workers, and the hive can to some extent cope with that. But if a solitary bee, who is the single carer for her offspring, loses her way and doesn't find her nest, that's all her offspring dead, right? So her fitness is reset to 0. So this pressure for a very precise spatial memory is very substantial in many wild species of bees, but of course also in honeybees and bumblebees. The next thing a bee has to learn is about flowers. Bees have to be careful shoppers in what I call the flower supermarket. That is, all the flower species that are available in any hive's flight range or nest's flight range. differ in their reward offerings, in their quality of nectar and its viscosity, or the pollen might differ depending on which flower species we're looking at. And bees have to compare different flower species and locate the ones that offer the best returns for the least effort. And then bees have to look for the signposts that characterize these species. They have to memorize the colors, the scents, the patterns of these flowers, and focus their efforts on the ones that they have experienced as most rewarding, and leave other ones to one side, unless the situation changes, in which case they'll have to reorient and find new flower species. And we, in a sense, simply capitalize on the bees' natural learning abilities by replacing the flowers with all kinds of other things where the bees can also get a reward. So what we see on the left here is an experiment by Adrian Dyer and my team, or who was at the time associated with my team. And the bee is about to land on a little platform with a nectar droplet in front of an image of a human face. And subsequently, after the bees had learned this, the face was now offered very much like in a crime witness test, in combination with a number of other different face images, spatially shuffled, so the bee couldn't just go back to the same place. And then we were asking, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that experiment actually was, can they find the correct face? And they could, actually with very high accuracy. And for us, that was just a somewhat curiosity-motivated experiment. For the bee, this is not necessarily a face, it's just a strange flower. It's a pattern that's associated with the reward, and that'll do for a bee. Curiously, weeks after we published this work, I had a person from the American military in my office, and this was early in the 2000s, and they were at the time awash with money for hunting terrorists and so on, and they were keen on somehow leveraging the principles of bee face recognition to implement in some sort of weapons, but I wasn't too forthcoming, I guess, with my collaboration. But anyway, there was an unexpected application, or people thought there might be one, of our work, but most of it is actually curiosity motivated. Now, back to navigation. Navigation for us humans is relatively easy. Here's a relatively difficult challenge, perhaps for most of us. So this is Shanghai. You might all have had the experience of navigating a foreign city where you couldn't perhaps read the signs, and perhaps your phone was out of battery and you couldn't talk to people, and you would just have to orient by landmarks. So it is a tough challenge to be in a new environment and find your way, but it's actually, for us humans, not that tough, at least in urban environments, because they consist of landmarks that are made to be memorable. These are all unique buildings, and you can remember their shapes quite easily because actually they were devised to stand out. Now, a bee's environment is more typically something like this. This is foggy hills near Popocatépetl in Mexico, and I've taken this picture because it actually is a typical bumblebee habitat, very mountainy, very foggy. And in this environment, there are no paths, there are no unique landmarks. There's lots of aliasing, lots of trees that all look highly similar and are easy to confuse with each other. And I don't know if any of you have done any hiking in such environments without the aid of a compass or a sat-nav. It is actually very tough. It's very easy to get lost. And so one challenge for a bee is that the nest might be under the tree in the center here. Only one tree. There's only one correct tree for that bee where there is the nest. There might be a good nectar patch over here behind that hill on the right, and there might be a good pollen patch over here on the left. And you have to reliably and independently of weather conditions not get lost in such an environment, which is not at all a trivial challenge. Now, the way we now study bee navigation is with a tool called harmonic radar, where you see this dish, the bottom dish on the right side is emitting a signal that's actually bounced back from what we call a transponder that's attached to a bee's back, and then this signal is picked up by the top dish. And so for using this equipment, we can track a bee's spatial whereabouts from her maiden flight to the end of her life, for an entire lifetime. This transponder on the bee's back looks humongous. It's very big compared to the bee's size, but it's very lightweight. It's actually just about 15 milligrams, so it's only a fraction of what a bee habitually carries when she forages for nectar and pollen. And what we can do with that equipment, here's an attempt of showing a bee's 3D flight path. We've had various attempts building a 3D tracking device, which was only very partially successful. But the dream behind that idea was that we could take the view from the bee's cockpit. This is a simulation by Vince Gallo, as she's flying through her environment, and that we could then reconstruct not just where the bee is, but also what she sees while she's flying. And in that way, find out what kind of natural landmarks the bee actually prioritizes in her navigation, and so on. But what certainly works quite well is our two-dimensional radar equipment, and these are experiments here by Joe Woodgate, who in this case asked the bees to solve a simple version of the traveling salesman problem. So this may be familiar to some of you. It's actually what it says. It's very simple. The traveling salesman faces the challenge of, when they're visiting a number of locations, perhaps some cities in the UK in a single day, to visit whatever, all the stores of a certain chain, then a challenge is to make a route that minimizes travel distance and time and saves petrol and so on. And it's not a trivial task, but it's one that bees have to solve on a daily basis, because flowers rarely deliver the amount of reward that a bee would need to fill up once and fly home. So flowers want to keep bees moving because they want the pollen to be transferred. So flower rewards are small. Bees have to visit multiple flowers, often multiple patches. And then the question is how to optimize the route. And so the challenge here is 5 feeding stations. The total amount of reward equates to 1 tummy load for a bee. And so she has to visit all of these locations to fill up once. And on the left here, you can see a track that's clearly still suboptimal. There's still quite a bit of exploration outside the area. In this slide and some other ones that will follow, green is always early in the track, yellow, orange in the middle, and red is later. And on the right side here, we have a single bee facing that challenge. So she has now started from the hive and found the first 2 feeding locations. She's still exploring. She's found 2 more now. Now she's found the 5th. The bout number of these radar tracks is shown top left. So we're now in 15 bouts. And you can see that there's still quite a bit of exploration outside the area, but the path is getting more and more streamlined. Exploration ceases, and the bee in the end finds a path that's optimal or very close to optimal for this simple version of the traveling salesman problem. So they're good at such challenges, just trying out a number of different possibilities and then zeroing in on one solution and then staying with it by and large for the next few flights. Now, another way of looking at bee navigation is to leave the bees to their own devices and ask them, how would you solve your spatial challenges if you're just feeding from natural flowers? And so this is a bee's maiden flight, what we're seeing here, the first flight she's ever leaving her nest. This is a bumblebee. And you can see that the blue dot here is the nest. She makes loops in various directions from the hive. Always returns to near the native home, but then comes flies out in a different direction and explores some more, and then comes back without entering the colony. This whole flight in nature took actually over 2 hours. Importantly, this will become of relevance later, there's one case in which she visits this forest edge during her very first orientation flight. Now, on the next day, we've monitored this bee for its entire lifetime, right? So on the next day, the bee makes one more exploratory loop into a southwesterly direction. That's the green loop here. And now she's found something. She's found a flower patch by this forest edge on the top left. And then for several dozen flights, she visits only that patch, like an assembly line worker, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, for several days and several dozen foraging bouts. And then there was a few days of inclement weather. After that, the bee returned again. Again, we're starting in green, later as orange, and finally red. The bee returned to that patch for a few more days after, a few more flights after this interruption. And then during one outbound flight to this familiar patch here, the bee just suddenly disappears from the radar because probably there was a radar shadow behind that tree, and then shows up at a patch where she'd only been once, 10 days earlier, during her very first orientation flight, and then just stays with that particular patch for the rest of her foraging days, until during one flight, she just vanishes off the radar permanently and never returned, probably having been taken by a bird or a crab spider on a flower. But that's a bee's whole career. That's all that bee ever did. A few hours of exploring her surroundings, then exploiting one patch, and then abandoning that patch and trading it for another one that she had visited on the very first flight of her life. Now, this is entirely observational data. It's not interfering with the bee's behavior in any way, but it was fascinating for us to see that she seemed to be able to retrieve a memory, a distant memory from the start of her life 10 days later, without actually the need to return back to the nest before flying to that other patch. Other bees, CVs, their careers look different. Some bees explore quite a good deal more during their entire lifetimes. Some never stop exploring at the expense of foraging efficiency. But yeah, so there's inter-individual differences also with how bees organize their lives. Now, when discussing this kind of work with my animal psychologist colleagues who work on primates and corvid birds and so on, they would often say, well, yes, we buy that the bees can learn spatial positions and flower colors and so on, but they have to do that every day. There's nothing surprising about the fact that they should be pre-programmed to learn about such things, about flowers and spatial positions. And conversely, so they said, we test our animals with challenges that they've never been faced before in their evolutionary history, to test their flexibility to cope with unusual challenges, and that to them indicates real intelligence. And one of the tasks that one of my bird cognition colleagues was at the time working on was a string pulling task. And here's a version of the string pulling task. The idea is that your actual reward is hidden visibly, but under a glass screen, and you need to pull on a string to get to that reward. So we simply have these artificial flowers under a screen, and the only way for the bee to get there is to pull a string. And here's the first bee. That was Sylvain Alem's work, the first bee that he had trained successfully. That's again a bumblebee, as you can see. And she's still a little clumsy at this task, but she manages it all right, until finally she's pulled out the string and is imbibing the reward. And in a more recent extension of this work, Chao Wen asked if there is some form of comprehension of the physics of the task. And so here the trick is that the bee has to recognize whether to pull a short string where the flower is also temptingly close, or to pull a longer string that's continuous. And she manages to do this just fine, as you can see in this task on the right. On the left side, there is a different version of this test where, again, there's a short, interrupted, but perpendicular string that that needs to be ignored, whereas there's a longer but diagonal string that will actually do the trick. And this bee is a bit flighty, so she tries several flowers, but she always tries the correct string. And now she finally pulls the flower and gets the reward. This is ongoing work. We still have to do some important controls, but intriguingly, the bees at least seem to spontaneously find the correct flower, even though we've played all kinds of tricks on them to make the task more difficult. Now, here's a social learning task. Here is a naive bee paired with an experienced bee. The experienced bee is marked with a red dot. The other bee has no idea yet what string pulling is all about. And in the end, after the experienced bee has pulled the string, they both get the rewards. So here they're happily sucking together. And you can see in the moment that the bees will get a bit nervous. That's when they have finished the rewards. And the experienced bee, the one that's marked with a red dot, knows quite well that there's nothing further to be had. So she just runs over to the next flower. The inexperienced one is still faffing about at the old one, thinking, oh, there might be something here somewhere. But in the end, she recognizes there isn't, and then runs over again to the experienced bee. So there's a clear favoritism to look what the experienced bee is doing rather than randomly rummaging about the arena. And if you do this a few times, the inexperienced bees will learn the tasks themselves. And in that way, the task will then continue to spread through an entire colony. And this is what's shown here. In this the circle, every single dot is one individual bee marked with a little number tag as we mark them. And you can see how the string pulling technique spreads through this colony like a meme through a social media network. You can see who copies it and how it's passed on from one individual to another. And so at the top here, the individual marked in yellow was the first bee that mastered the task. And all the ones, the moment a dot turns colored, that means that bee has now also managed the task. And you can see now several orange dots. These are all second generation learners, so to speak, that have all picked up the technique from the first individual that figured it out. But there's also now at the bottom right a purple individual, and that bee has no longer learned the task from the first generation learner, but from the second generation learners. Now, these are not biological generations, they are sequential sets of learning bees. But the technique here continues to spread also from the second generation learners until eventually all the bees in the colony, all the foragers have figured it out. And in this case, actually continues to spread even after the original skilled individual has passed away. And so the technique there persists over, spreads by a cultural-like process and persists even after the original inventor is no longer in the crowd. And once you've trained a good number of bees and leave them foraging freely from such flowers, this is what you'll see. So they are then actually multiple individuals jointly pulling on flowers to remove all of them from underneath the table. And my former team member, Olli Lukola, is currently exploring whether bees actually can learn to collaborate actively in such tasks. Now, the next experiment, I will have it introduced by Jane Goodall. I hope you can hear her voice.
The most recent example which blows people's minds is the bumblebee. And the bumblebee has been taught to roll a little ball. He rolls it backwards, rolls the little ball until he can push it down, or maybe she, I don't know, into a hole, like a goal. And as soon as this little ball gets into the goal, the bumblebee is given a little drop of nectar as a reward. So they learn to do this. But the mind-blowing thing is of the bumblebees who've merely watched a taught bumblebee can do the same without being taught, just by watching. And that is supposed to be a mark of very superior intelligence. So this is something we're learning all the time. We have been far too arrogant. The animal kingdom of which we are a part is filled with secrets. And gosh, I'd love to be young and learning about these things now, because all the doors are wide open and you never know what you're going to find.
All right, thank you, Jane. So this for me was very moving, because for me, Jane Goodall and people like her were primary inspirations to become a biologist in the first place, and for her to notice our work on bees and to express that she'd like to be young now and explore these minds of other animals was very moving indeed. So as Jane Goodall explained, so the task here is to move this little ball to a target area, and then there's a reward that's released to the bee if she's got this correctly. And we were again interested in asking whether bees could learn this by observation from each other. But in this case, we played a little trick. And the trick here is, again, we have one individual that is skilled in the technique and another one that is a naive observer. There are 3 balls here. And obviously, the best way to solve the task, if you're going to get it to the goal area marked with a yellow circle, is you pick the closest ball. However, this demonstrator bee, the one that's experienced, knows that that's not possible because the 2 closest balls are glued down. Okay, so she learns she can only move the furthest ball, and that's what she does here. She moves the furthest ball, rolls it to the center, and then both individuals get a reward. And this is what this naive individual is shown 3 times. And we're then asking, what does the naive bee do when she's now put on the spot and asked, hey, how would you solve the task? And in this case, however, the balls are not glued down. And we're asking, basically, are you now simply going to ape the demonstrator and pick the same most distant ball and roll that to the center? Or will you pick the closest ball? And here's what the bee does. She picks the closest ball. She's not simply copying what she has seen the experienced bee do. She's rolling a ball, and in that she is imitating the action to some extent. She knows where it goes, but she does not just copy or ape the demonstrator's actions. And that indicates to us that there's some sort of appreciation of the desired outcome of the task, that the bee understands in some way that this is the desired goal rather than simply copying actions. Now, do bees have mental images of flowers? We know that they can recognize flower patterns very well. Here's again a simulation by Vince Gallo of a bee looking at a flower. And the question, though, is that the recognition of flowers does not necessarily mean that the bee actually stores a little image of the flower. She might recognize the flower by simple feature detectors, edge detectors, color detectors, and so on. The question is, does she have a little virtual image, so to speak, of the object in her mind? And one way of asking that is whether the bees can recognize shapes in a different sensory modality to the one that they have been trained in. And so this is a very simple task. We're continuing here our work with balls. But in this case, the bees have to discriminate them from cubes. And the bee can, in this case, see the different shapes, but not touch them. Okay, so that the shapes are under a plexiglass lid, and she has to learn that one shape comes with the reward, the other one does not. And we then test the bees in complete darkness. And so in this case, we can monitor the behavior with infrared light. They can't see at all, but they can now use their tactile sense to recognize one or the other objects. And it turns out that the bees that have been trained through vision but not touch to recognize round things, bally things, spheres, spontaneously recognize these also when they can touch them. So they spend a longer time on them when they can touch but not see them. And we also did the reverse experiment where we first trained the bees in the dark. They had never seen these shapes before. And after they'd learned to recognize them in the dark, we measured their preferences in light, and spontaneously they could again recognize balls if they were trained on balls. We also trained the reverse association. This indicates to us that indeed there is a kind of mental representation of the shape properties in the bees' minds that they can access from different sensory modalities. You're seeing this first here. This paper is not published yet. Samadhi Galpayaj has recently expanded this work with bees moving balls to ask the question of whether they're actually enjoying this activity, if they return to it without being rewarded with sugar. And indeed, that seems to be the case. And it's especially young foragers that engage with this activity. This will only be published in about 2 weeks, so there's a little taster of forthcoming work. Now, this question of enjoying things leads us to the final and perhaps most controversial question: do bees have some sort of emotions? And when I first started working with bees 30 years ago, people would have regarded that as ridiculous. You would have been regarded as anthropomorphizing and not being taken seriously. But over the last few decades, we actually have had increasing, a number of lines of evidence that at least point in that direction. And here's one such experiment by Tom Ings about 15 years ago. And he was interested in the first instance whether bees can learn about predation threat. And you might all know these nasty predators that lurk on many flowers and can actually adopt, chameleon style, the colors of the flowers on which they hunt. So yellow spiders on yellow flowers, white crab spiders on white flowers. And we took that situation into the laboratory, basically building life-size models of the crab spiders and pairing these with solenoid-driven pincers that would briefly capture a bee between 2 sponge pads and then release it to see if they could learn about this predation threat. And here's a little video clip of how that looks. Here the bee is landing on a safe flower, nothing happens. And now she's making a mistake and landing on a crab spider flower. And you can see the bee is not happy, but she's uninjured. So these pads are very soft, so the bees were not harmed in any way. And remarkably, or perhaps unsurprisingly, in the first instance, the bees learned about this threat just fine. They made fewer and fewer numbers of such errors over time. So they could learn about this threat very well. But the surprising thing for us was that not only had their whole demeanor changed after such predation attacks, so they would extensively scan every flower with side-to-side scanning movements before landing on them, which makes sense because you want to make sure that you don't miss a crab spider that's hiding on the flower. But they also displayed increased numbers of false alarms. That is, they would scan a flower that was perfectly safe and then fly away and abandon it, apparently going, that doesn't look quite right, I won't land here. And these false alarms, where the bees were essentially seeing ghosts, they were responding to a threat that wasn't there, that was only in their minds, so to speak. Well, it at least superficially looked like someone or something with a post-traumatic stress disorder, but that was not a formal test of such a phenomenon. It was just an observation that got us thinking at the time. And you can, of course, test emotional states in animals more formally using established paradigms from work in domestic animals, sheep, goats, and horses, and so on. And what you're testing in this case is a version of the glass half full, glass half empty task. That is a paradigm that's well, it's familiar from a human proverb. So if you're optimistic, then you judge this glass, which is actually ambiguous. Physically, it's just in the middle. If you're optimistic, you'll judge that as, oh, it's still half full, everything's fine, good outlook. If you're a pessimist or you're currently pessimistic, you'll judge it as, oh, it's almost already gone, more or less, not looking good. And so this kind of test is used in various forms for domestic animals or zoo animals to find out if they're kept under conditions that are conducive to their well-being. And we borrowed this paradigm and used it on bees. And so the paradigm that we used is we trained bees to fly into a flight arena, and they learned that on the left side, there's a blue, if there's a blue target on the left side, you get a reward. You always get a sugar reward. If on the other end, there's green on the right, you do not get a reward. It's always unrewarded. And we do that a few times. There's only ever one stimulus present, so either blue or green. And after the bees have learned this, they will fly without hesitation to the blue target, and with a great deal of hesitation, will they accept the green target. So in this case, they're faffing about for minutes before they'll say, okay, I might after all land there if nothing else is forthcoming. And so we can measure these hesitation times of the bees with which they accept these targets. Now here's our glass that's 50% filled. That's the ambiguous stimulus in the middle. And we're now asking the bees, do you judge this as more likely being rewarding or unrewarding? And it turns out that, as you might expect, the response times to the ambiguous stimuli are in the middle between blue and green. But crucially, the response to this turquoise stimulus in the middle depends on what happened to the bees before they even entered the experiment. If they had had a little surprise reward before the test, the little droplet of sugar solution, they would judge the ambiguous stimulus as more likely rewarding than they otherwise would. So this is shown in this graph on the right. Positive stimulus, always a very fast response. Negative stimulus, fly around for 2 minutes before you even consider it. All the other responses are in between for turquoise or bluish turquoise or greenish turquoise. But for all the bees that had had a little surprise reward, they'd respond faster to this ambiguous stimulus as if they were judging it more likely as a positive thing. And you can do the reverse. So Jerry Wright, then at Newcastle, now at Oxford University, did an experiment where she exposed the bees to a surprise predation-like attack before such a test. And in that case, the bees judged the ambiguous stimuli in the opposite direction, more likely to be accompanied by a negative outcome. So by the same criteria as domestic animals, mammals are judged as having emotional biases. You find we're not lowering the bar. We're using the same criteria. We find the same in bees. So I'll skip excursions into the bee brain just to say that they're amazingly complex and elegantly miniaturized. But I will wrap up with my conclusions now. So I think that we have evidence that bees have representations, mental representations of space, of things in space that they can learn by observation, display forms of at least simple tool use in a manner that indicates intentionality or some sort of outcome awareness of their actions. They also appear to have access to a memory of what they want, and explore suitable solutions to get where they want, including some sort of awareness of the outcomes. And finally, at least by the same criteria as much larger brained animals are judged, they also appear to have at least simple emotion-like states. And all of these, I think, are key ingredients of a mind. And so I think this places on us the obligation to look after these animals. And I know you all look after your domestic bees, but I think the conclusion expands to wild bees, of course, that we are just one of many other thinking and suffering and enjoying beings in a world of other thinking and suffering and enjoying beings. And even though these beings have very different minds and perceptions, I think we owe them something. We owe them to preserve the environments under which these minds have evolved and now thrive. And yeah, so I guess that was already mentioned at the start, but I have this new book out, which I'm super excited by because it's my first book. So if you've enjoyed today's presentation, then you might also like the book. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be really happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Lars. So just to say to everybody, if you'd like to ask a question, can you write it in the chat facility at the bottom of the page? But the first comment I'd like to say is that somebody has said, the mind of the beekeeper is blown. So that's their comment about this whole thing. So let me go back to some of these questions. Somebody has asked if you've done any research on drones and their daily activities regarding finding and flying to drone congregation areas and returning to their home hives and drifting and all that sort of thing.
Yes, so Joe Woodgate and my team has studied the behavior of drones using harmonic radar, because there's still, as many of you might be aware, some controversy about whether drone congregation areas actually exist. And the reason for that question mark is that many of the classical studies of such areas were done with lures, with live queens or queen pheromone. And that, of course, is a very strong stimulus to potentially induce the formation of a congregation. So some people have said drone congregation areas might be a simple result of there being such lures and then all the drones converging on this attractive scent. That, it turns out, is not the case. So these drone congregation areas form by themselves in the absence of queens. And so Joe's radar tracking studies have shown that they actually congregate in certain areas that are also stable from year to year, as many, of course, have observed in the past. Interestingly, also, he found that drones will not just visit a single favored such area, but seem to patrol between multiple drone congregation areas sequentially to see if there's any action to be had at them.
Great, thanks, Lars. Second part to that question was saying, have you discovered any bee behavior that would be beneficial to those beekeepers who practice beelining, you know, in terms of trying to find especially wild bees in trees and things?
Well, I'm not sure if I have any new tricks to add to their repertoire. Of course, the technique is quite clever. It's basically exploiting a bee's spatial memory by capturing them and then releasing them to see which directions they vanish in. And if you do that with multiple bees, then of course you can triangulate to locate a wild bee colony. There's even anecdotal evidence that these techniques were used in various indigenous peoples around the globe, including, for example, in wild bees in Australia, for example, not honeybees in this case. So it's a clever technique. I don't know. I don't think that we have discovered anything that would help improving the technique, but yeah, it's a magnificent way to exploit a bee's navigation to locate their colony, of course.
Thank you. So somebody says, bees see in the infrared spectrum. If experiments are carried out under infrared light, are the bees not able to see the targets?
So there might be a little confusion here. Bees are able to see ultraviolet light at the other end of the spectrum. So they can see shorter wavelengths than we humans can see, but not longer ones. So they cannot see infrared light any more than we can. In fact, they can't even see as far into the red as humans can, and therefore many people working with bees in the laboratory, for example, experiment with them under red light, which is visible to the human observers, but less so for the bees. There are some animals, including night hunting snakes and fire beetles that lay their eggs on the bark of freshly burned trees that do have an infrared sensitivity, but bees do not see infrared light. They do see ultraviolet though.
Thank you. So somebody's asking, well, firstly saying what a fascinating talk, but then saying, what's your view of testing on bees and other insects? For example, testing of the impact of pesticides. How should science proceed in the light of these results on bee cognition?
That's a very good question. And my view on this has changed at least a little bit over the decades. So the view that was common when I was a young PhD student, that's still quite widespread in many neuroscientific researchers working on bees, or in fact many other animals, is that many other insects, is that there is nothing to worry about invasive neuroscientific treatments, drilling electrodes into the brains or other parts of the nervous system of tethered bees, and so on. And at the time, the thinking was decades ago that there is not even a remote chance that bees might experience something unpleasant or experience pain. I now have doubts, to be quite honest, about whether we can be certain about this. And at least, I think, at least given what we know now about the possibility of sentience and the possibility to suffer, I think we need to have greater certainty on such matters before we continue uninhibited with such experiments. By we, I mean other researchers. We do not do invasive neuroscientists' work. It's a little tricky with questions about pesticides and so on, because you have to weigh the costs and benefits of such work. The neuroscientific work on how bees respond to and suffer from pesticides, of course, bees, other insects are sacrificed in the process, but the results of such work might potentially benefit billions of insects if they lead to, for example, the outlawing of certain pesticides and so on. So I would still say that such research is necessary towards the greater good of benefiting insects, but it is, I think we need to be aware that at least there is some risk that this is a profoundly unpleasant experience for those animals that are involved with such research.
So this question is just saying, what was the most personal, surprising, or exciting result from any of your experiments?
That's a difficult one, but there have been many. And I think that just goes to show what Nobel laureate Calvin Frisch already expressed many decades ago, that bees are a kind of magic well where the more you draw from it, the more discoveries you have to, you might yet make. So one of my early findings that bees can count landmarks. For example, I was just a young PhD student and we were just exploring, and that already was shocking. I mean, it was such a surprise. And later, when Adrian Dyer did this work on bees recognizing images of human faces, again, often we couldn't believe what we were seeing the bees doing. And likewise with the more recent work on tool use or simple versions of it and so on. It's, if you see this the first time in front of you in your lab, it's mind-blowing. So there's not a simple hierarchy of what was most exciting. There were many such findings.
Great. So just the next question really is sort of references that whole thing that you talked about earlier about bees remembering faces. And this question is saying, do you think then, do bees remember or identify their beekeepers? And is it face-based or behavior and smell? I mean, I guess your research would suggest it was face-based, but
so we don't know the answer to this. It's certainly not entirely implausible. So just to repeat briefly, so the experiment that we did on that occasion was using simple black and white images of frontal views of human faces. And we don't know how their ability to recognize such images would generalize to a moving person that will approach the hive in different clothes from time to time, smelling slightly differently depending on what they've eaten and what their clothes have been washed with, and so on. So the challenge of identifying a real person independently of clothes and lighting conditions and so on is a bigger one than just recognizing an image of the human face. But so I think definitive proof that they can actually identify a live beekeeper remains to be done, but it's not wholly impossible. I had one interesting observation in this case on a handicapped bumblebee queen by a lady from Scotland who wrote to me some years ago, who had found a wingless or a crippled wing bumblebee queen early in spring, and then took this bee home and fed her and warmed her and so on. And it was a very moving story because this bee, at least on the face of it, seemed to be very attached to the lady who had found and rescued her and interacted with her on a daily basis. She even put there are plenty of images of her carrying the bee queen on her nose. And these queens can sting, and in fact, very powerfully if they want to. So at least on superficially, it looked like there was a recognition of that particular person. But again, it's anecdotal and there's no scientific proof. So you would have to test whether, let's say in this case, that bumblebee queen would have been aggressive to other individuals. And if so, was this a question of recognition by scent, as you suggest, or a visual recognition, or a combination of both? So it's an open question, but an interesting one.
There's a very quick question here. Do you keep bees yourself?
We only now keep bumblebees, unfortunately for health and safety reasons. So our freely flying honeybees that we had kept on the terrace outside my office window were a health and safety concern in our densely populated East London environment. And our health and safety people were always worried that our students might get stung and someone might have an allergic reaction, and then the university might be in legal trouble. So they piled on so much pressure that in the end, unfortunately, I had to give our honeybee hives away, and we now have just the bumblebees inside the lab.
So somebody's saying here, do you think that the bees recognize the fake spiders? So in that particular piece of research, do you think they recognize them as spiders, or a bit like the facial recognition of the photo, just saw them as some kind of indicator, not necessarily a predator. You know, they saw that shape and then they knew that, you know, they might get clamped by the sponge things.
Yeah, so in the experiments that I've showed, the bees were entirely naive at the start with respect to these crab spiders and had to learn over time to avoid them. Tom Ings, who did these experiments at the time, also did some further work asking whether there's some spontaneous recognition of spider-like things over other shapes, some shapes that the bees would tend to avoid. And from memory, this is now 15 years ago, this was indeed the case, but this work unfortunately was never published. So from memory, yes, there's some sort of spontaneous recognition of spider-like things or shapes, but that's unpublished work, and so take that with a grain of salt. I'm not confident on what we found.
Do you think that the experiments you've shown apply equally to honeybees as well as bumblebees?
Many, yes. So for much of the work, we're using bumblebees for sheer convenience because we can work with them all year round, even in the winter months. And we can also, because they're entirely comfortable inside laboratory environments where they just fly inside a small tent, they need less space than the honeybees. But many of the tasks that we've shown, including, for example, the work on counting was initially done on honeybees and then later on bumblebees, in fact, also in my lab, and they were both equally good at it. One of my students at the time the string pulling was done also tried that with honeybees, and they didn't manage for the sheer reason that the contraption was too heavy for the honeybees, so they couldn't pull it. But I have no doubts that they would also be able to engage with that if the task is made physically possible for them.
Okay, so a couple of people are asking about future research. Have you got other things in the pipeline, for example, sound, magnetic lines or scent? And also somebody's asking about whether you considered the effects of agricultural chemicals on bee behavior, you know, possibly like neonics or something.
Mm-hmm. So to some of these questions, I have to say that including the influence of neonicotinoids on behavior and the work on scent learning, is that we're not doing this work in part because there are so many other excellent labs already working on this, and so there's no need to reinvent the wheel on that front. There are, of course, other things that interest us and will continue to interest us, and our work in recent years has been quite strongly focused on the question of whether bees and other insects might be indeed sentient, whether they have a capacity for an emotional life, and also the question of whether they can experience pain, which is hugely important for research ethics and also how we treat animals in laboratories and so on. So this is something that I would like to continue because it builds on our curiosity motivated work on the minds of bees, but also I think has important ethical implications. So we need more knowledge on that front, I think.
Somebody's asked if so obviously in some of your experiments you're marking bees, and somebody's asked whether other bees notice that or have any sort of reaction to bees that are marked and that look slightly different.
Mm-hmm. So the marks, the little number tags that we're using do not seem to cause any aggression from guard bees at the nest entrance, either in honeybees or bumblebees, from what we've seen. If the bees are released after being number tagged too soon, into the hive, then sometimes the scent of the glue is what induces increased vigilance and sometimes attacks from guard bees. But a simple way to avoid that is to wait 5-10 minutes for at least much of the scent to have evaporated, and then these bees are accepted into the colonies without their native colonies without any kind of adverse reaction from guard bees.
Okay, there's a question here about competition between bees for resources. So the question is, if a bee sees a competitor for resources, might it behave differently, trying to beat the competitor in order to be the first one at the resource? And it goes on to say, do you have an experiment in mind to probe this ability for the bee to project itself into the mind of another bee?
So that's a very interesting question. It's one that is of great interest also to my primate colleagues, to ask whether there's some sort of mental perspective taking in animals that allows an animal to know what another animal knows or sees. I'm not sure if we'll find something like this in bees specifically. So in corvid birds, for example, some species hide food, and they'll be very good at first of all, if they're observed by other birds while they're caching the food, they will avoid hiding the food because they know that spells trouble as I'm being observed. So they will, in such cases, actually fake cache food and then hide it somewhere else later on. So there is some sort of mental perspective taking. I don't think that bees are that smart, but I might be wrong. I've often been wrong on just how intelligent they were in the past, and then we or other people did find that they could master a task, but I somehow doubt that. There is quite a bit of antagonistic interactions, though, at food sources, and you might, as beekeepers, have experienced robbing of your colonies by other bees that have tried to invade your colony, and then there are sometimes major battles ensuing. It also depends on species. So, for example, in some stingless bees, there are vicious battles between different bee species competing for food sources where bees will actually bite and attack and often kill competitors at food sources that they're jointly exploiting. But I'm not sure whether the known behaviors in this context require any mental perspective taking. Maybe they do, but for all we know, they might be explicable by largely innate routines of defending a food source that's under the control of one particular species or one colony of bees.
So somebody's actually asked about whether you did find any differences, but I'm not sure whether you actually did the research into the various Apis mellifera species like Italian, Carniolan, various things, Scutellata. Did you do any things when you were looking at that, any of your research?
So we've done quite a bit of comparative research with multiple bumblebee species, and there are very strong differences, for example, in innate color preferences, the flower colors that they will prefer before they've ever seen a flower. We in our team have not looked at different lines of Apis mellifera or indeed different species of Apis, but others have. And so, for example, in the familiar dance communication system, there are indeed appreciable and reliable differences between races and also different species of honeybees. So that, for example, in some species, the distance code is expressed with different durations of the waggle run.
Okay, thank you. Do you think somebody's wondering whether the various viruses that are vectored by Varroa are having a cumulative effect on degrading the behavior of bees? Obviously, those out in the field, that would be.
That's undoubtedly the case. So, I mean, any single disease, of course, can already weaken an organism or any parasite. But if that parasite also, as in the case of Varroa, transmits not just one, but multiple pathogens, then in combination, this can indeed push a bee colony over the edge. And you have to imagine that in addition to these biological stressors, of course, in many agricultural settings, the bees have to cope on top of that with pesticides. So all of these stressors jointly, of course, can have very detrimental effects. Add to that, especially in the United States and some other parts of the world, the stresses of migratory beekeeping. So you might know that a very substantial fraction, over a third of all North American honeybee colonies or all US honeybee colonies are shipped into a tiny corner of the country during the California almond bloom for 2 or 3 weeks, and then subsequently transported back to other pollination events or their location of origin. And so if you were an epidemiologist devising a method for first spreading a disease and then in the entire population of bees and then spreading that back to where these bees came from, you couldn't devise a worse plan, basically.
There's a great question here. How did you teach the first bee to roll the ball into the center?
With a little plastic dummy bee. So we had a dummy bee that was attached to a transparent plastic string, so it actually looked like a little bee, and we just very gently nudged the ball into the center and then gave a reward. And so that was how we started. But once you have one bee going, that bee can subsequently instruct all the other bees, so to speak.
So somebody's got a question here coming back to the spider experiment, saying that obviously mostly when bees encounter spiders, they don't survive the attack. Obviously, some of them, yours didn't actually get eaten, they just got a little bit squashed. But somebody is asking, if that's out in the wild, what are you inferring from that experiment?
Yeah, so from our observations and others, it's only about 10% of the crab spider attacks on honeybees or bumblebees that are successful. So in 9 out of 10 cases, the bee gets away. And that, of course, means there's quite a bit of room for learning to avoid this threat. It's only a minority of bees that actually successfully get caught by the spider on the first attempt.
Okay. There's so many questions here that are all absolutely fascinating, just pulling out things from all the research that you've done. So there's lots of people asking about different types of research. So did you get any insight into honeybee swarming behavior in your tracking experiments, or anything on the placement of hives on underground water? You want to say something about those two, and then there's another one which is to do with that comb experiment that Vince did.
So we did not do any work on honeybee swarming behavior, in part because the work that's already out there by Tom Seeley is so wonderful. And so I encourage everyone to, if you haven't already, to read Tom Seeley's book, Honeybee Democracy, which is absolutely fascinating in its exploration of the consensus building that goes on in honeybee swarms. And so most of you might know this, but just in case, I'll explain briefly what goes on there. So once you have the swarm cluster, which all of you have seen, there are scouts going out over a huge territory of many square miles, hunting around for suitable nesting locations. And then they come back using their honeybee dance to communicate the coordinates of what they found. And over time, so this process can, as you know, last for days, they achieve a complete consensus. So while initially there's a great deal of disagreement and different scouts will say different things depending on what they individually have discovered, over time more and more bees converge on just one potential solution. And once that happens, the entire cloud lifts off and flies to the new destination. So you have a completely decentralized decision-making process, which, however, functions with an almost inevitable result of a completely unanimous vote, so to speak, or result where everyone finally agrees on the same destination. And when that phenomenon was first discovered by Martin Lindauer in the 1950s, his supervisor, Calvin Frisch, congratulated him and said, well, you've just witnessed the perfect parliamentary debate, and that humans could learn a lot from the bees' ability to agree unanimously on something that was initially controversial. So Tom Seeley's book is magnificent on this topic.
Right, thanks. So moving on to that research that Vince did on the comb, and particularly the experiment where the bees turned the comb by 90 degrees when the glass plate was put in. This person's asking if another plate was placed on the sidewall, you know, in the direction where the turn was heading, would you expect the comb to actually turn back 180 degrees on itself and reattach itself to the first wall so that the comb forms like an arc or rainbow shape? Sounds astonishing.
That's a magnificent suggestion, but no, that experiment has not been done either by Vince or 200 years ago by Hubert, to my knowledge. I'd have to reread Hubert's book, but if I remember correctly, that experiment has not yet been done, but it's a good suggestion.
Yeah. Do you raise your bumblebees from queens yourself, or do you bring in colonies from outside? And if you are rearing them, have you got any recommendations for starting or raising bumblebees colonies in captivity?
Yeah, so we do a bit of both. So bumblebees are now commercially available for pollination purposes. So the colonies are put in tomato greenhouses, and for that reason they're shipped all over the world, and so that offers an opportunity for us to purchase them. But when I first started working with them, that was not as straightforward, and also I didn't have much funding. So we started out, and we still occasionally do this, to raise colonies from wild-caught queens. So what you do in a nutshell is basically you identify queens during spring that are in the process of locating a suitable nesting site. And so, for example, if they have pollen already, don't catch them, because that means they're already provisioning brood and they have offspring to look after. But if they're flying close to the ground and inspecting mouse holes, for example, repeatedly, then they're currently looking for nests, and then we catch them and we place them in a wooden box. Others use various plastic boxes and so on. And we give them a little bit of wool and a ball of pollen and some nectar. And then over time, with a bit of luck, they'll start setting up a colony. And the success depends very much on the species. We've raised many species successfully, but the commercial bee breeders use Bombus terrestris. And the reason is, I think, that they are the most easily raisable ones under such conditions. With others, it's more difficult.
Great. So a question here is, if a single bee can learn to solve a problem, do you think that a whole colony could learn to solve more complex problems?
it's possible, though the learning, of course, still takes place in individual bees. Through the sheer force of multiple individuals being present, of course, they could presumably cope with tougher challenges. But the colony as a whole doesn't learn. It's the individuals in the colony that gradually pick up a skill. And once multiple have picked it up, they could, in theory, collaborate on a task towards a common good. But I don't think that there is actually a kind of distributed mind or a swarm intelligence, as some people sometimes say.
Do you think that individual bees have got different learning method preferences, a bit like humans have?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And the answer is yes. So for whatever learning task we're testing, or other psychological traits for that matter, there is huge variation between individuals of a colony, but also between different colonies. And so, for example, in the string pulling task that I had shown earlier, the vast majority of bees require training, either by us as experimenters, where we first give them the flowers open access and then gradually push them under the glass screen, or training by observing other conspecifics. But 2 out of over 100 individuals that we tested figured it out spontaneously, without any kind of instruction, just by being very exploratory and ultimately figuring out by themselves how to pull a string for reward. And there are often a few individuals, genius bees, if you wish, that figure out tasks extremely rapidly and in manners that we wouldn't have anticipated. There was one experiment where we measured the foraging performance of bees under natural free flight conditions, outside foraging from natural flowers, and correlated that with their learning ability in the lab. And this measuring of foraging efficiency outside required us to briefly capture the bees and put them on a scale, weigh them on departure, and then weigh them again, the same individuals again, when they had returned. So that we used a little dark container, so to keep them relatively quiet while they were being weighed for a few seconds. And most bees initially resisted capture with this container until they got used to it. And in the end, they sort of resigned them to the fact that this would happen. But we had one individual that actually learned to fly directly into the dark container and then sat there and expected to be transported to the hive or from the hive via the scales, basically using it as a kind of public transport. So there are, for whatever trait we measure, there are big variations between individuals. Some are also very shy, others are more neophilic, if you wish. Some are more aggressive, obviously, and others less. And these are reliable individual and also reliable colony traits.
Really interesting. So somebody's asking, do you think that sort of ability of bees to learn could be used to teach them to do things like getting rid of varroa mites from their bodies?
I think people have tried that with possibly mixed success. So I remember once I was contacted by a Swiss honeybee biologist who works with varroa, Peter Neumann, and he seemed very excited that something like this seemed to be taking place in his colonies. But that was years ago, and I've never seen it published. I've emailed him intermittently, how was that work going? Because I was very excited by it. But he hasn't reported any progress, so it might have been an artifact or just a chance observation that ultimately wasn't substantiated. Very good question, but I don't know is the honest answer.
So I'm going to have this as the last question, which is talking about learning tasks at different stages of the life of the bee. So obviously honeybees, at different ages have various functions within the hive. And do you think that there is a difference in the ability of bees to learn at different ages, or to learn the tasks you've been setting them?
Yes. So, as you know, of course, very young honeybee adults mostly spend their first days inside the hive with various tasks that range from provisioning the brood and cleaning the hive, and building activities and so on, to later activities as guard bees at the nest entrance, and finally as forager bees. And it turns out that the whole transition of from within hive tasks to outside tasks is accompanied by a quite drastic growth of a certain brain region in the bees, the so-called mushroom bodies. And these are known as centers of associative memory and also multisensory integration. And so these mushroom bodies grow already before that transition takes place, that transition to outside foraging, as a kind of preparation for perhaps building a bigger hard drive for memory, so to speak, and continues after that transition has taken place. And in correlation with that, of course, younger within hive bees are not as good at forming olfactory memories, for example, as our forager bees that have already transitioned from within hive tasks to outside the hive.
Right. I think we'll leave the questions there. Thank you for being so generous with your time in terms of answering.
Oh, no problem at all. And if any of you have further questions, just send me an email and I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion, very interesting questions as well.
Yeah. So what I'd like to do now, Lars, if it's okay, I'd like to just stop your sharing, or maybe you could do that so we can just see everybody.
Yep.
And just a question that did come on that I'd just like to say to everybody is, Lars has generously agreed for us to record this session, and it will be up on the Somerset Beekeepers website in time, and you'll be able to access that if you are a member of Somerset Beekeepers. If you're not a member, you can very quickly and easily join it from the website, and then you have access to all the recordings that we have held there, which is a fantastic resource. And also, can I just say, before I hand over to Stephen, who I hope is there this time, that we normally have bee chat after our talk. So we'll have a brief interlude, a comfort break, or time for a cup of tea. And then any of you are welcome to come back, and it's just a chance to chat about bees or the lecture or anything like that. And if there's tons of you, what we'll do is divide everybody up into smaller rooms, so you've got a real chance to actually chat rather than talking to loads of people at the same time. So that will happen after. We'll just have a little break after we've finished things here. But I'd like now to call on Stephen and Richard. Are they there?
Yes, we're here.
Right. Oh, yeah, there. Great. Just to finish off proceedings. So, okay. Can I hand over to you just to...
Lars, first of all, many apologies, Lars. We are in a different location and weren't able to introduce your talk this evening. We were on the way back from the National Bee Unit, a fascinating day there.
Okay.
But we did have a wonderful day with you in August and your various PhD students, two of whom may well have gained their PhDs by now, and also the postdocs. So thank you very much for that. Beecraft readers, I hope will look forward to reading about that, reading about our conversations with your researchers there. And I think the swarm of beekeepers watching this will take no time at all in reaching a consensus that the work you're doing is absolutely amazing, absolutely eye-opening, and it's changing my approach to beekeeping already. I'm going to hand over to Richard. And also thank you, Lynn, for inviting Beecraft to sponsor the talk. Thank you very much indeed. Lynn and Somerset Beekeeping Association. But I'm going to hand over to Richard, who's going to announce the winner of your signed book, Lars.
I am. First of all, as Stephen said, we have the great privilege of visiting you, Lars, in your lab in London a few months ago, and we're all familiar with Hollywood's idea of a mad scientist's laboratory, and I have to say that it's absolutely eye-opening because it was a fascinating visit. Your lab is full of the most amazing Heath Robinson contraptions cobbled together out of blue tack and sticky tape and plexiglass and so on. But I mean, your talk tonight has obviously left us all in no doubt that there's a lot more going on in the mind of a bee. But you know, I'd like to pay homage really to what's going on in the mind of you and your researchers, and how lucky we are that there are people coming up with these extraordinary. I mean, I don't know how you devise these various experiments to show us the things that they do, but it's really, really exciting. It was a real privilege to see them. And as you know, I took lots of photographs, and we'll be having those in the magazine over the next few months. But we have had some extracts from your book in Beecraft recently, and we've run a competition, and many of you have sent in your entries, so thank you very much indeed. And we very scientifically wrote them all on bits of paper and threw them into the Beecraft skep, and had a rummage around and pulled out a lucky winner. And I don't know if you're with us this evening, but the winner was Carol Gunn from Caithness. Congratulations, Carol, if you're there. I don't know if you are or not, but we'll be in touch with you very soon. And for those of you not lucky enough to have won yourself a copy of the book, I highly recommend it. It's a terrific read. Very, very significant piece of work. We think it's one of the most important bee books to have been bought out for many years. And you will have been emailed a code this evening for a discount on that book. So please do take advantage of that if you can. And with that, I'll hand you back to Lynn.
I was trying just at that moment to magically share this thing of from Beecraft, which is, but for some reason, again, some sort of technical hitch, I can't. I
think we need the bees to maintain the broadband and the Zoom this evening. I think they do a better job than the service providers somehow.
Yes, definitely. Well, maybe what would be a really great thing would be if everybody could show their appreciation to Lars, and obviously to Beecraft sponsoring a bit, particularly Lars, with an absolutely fantastic evening. I think it'd be amazing if we could just really show that in the normal way. So everybody.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Looks like Carol's not with us just at the moment. But okay, if you'd like to join us for Bee Chat, do go off and get yourself a cup of tea, glass of cider, glass of wine, whatever your own thing is, and come back in about 5 minutes, and then we can carry on with the conversations, talk about the thing tonight or anything at all. But if you're not going to join us, thank you, and to any of you, thank you so much for coming along tonight. It's been absolutely fantastic to see you all again, and hopefully see some of you next week when our presentation will be very different, very practical, about how best to look after yourself when you're lugging those tremendously heavy super boxes that are full of honey, and how to do that without hurting your back. So do look on the website, and do sign up for various lectures we've got coming up. So see you all soon, and take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.